Hello and welcome to the Tesla NanoCoatings Teslin 2x1 Wet Edge Application Process Training Module. This module is designed to familiarize the applicator with the proper procedures to use when applying Tesla NanoCoatings products via the Teslin 2x1 Wet Edge Wet-on-Wet application method. What does the 2x1 wet edge, wet-on-wet application mean? Quite literally, it means exactly what it suggests. Tesla NanoCoatings has developed the ability to apply their Teslin top coats to wet, uncured primers that have not dried. Clients are realizing dramatic increases in productivity due to the ability of applying multiple coats at one visit with the same crew on the same day. The results include a reduction in backlog work, reduced downtime, reduced POB, and faster return to service. You're getting double the protection at half the cost. Applying Tesla coatings via the 2x1 wet edge process is as easy as remembering three simple steps: apply, allow, and apply. Let's see how these three steps apply to the Teslin epoxy top coat process. For the 2x1 epoxy wet edge process, you will apply the appropriate Teslin primer for your specific application. You will allow a minimum of a 30-minute flash-off period where the solvents will evaporate. Please note that the flash-off period may vary depending upon temperature and humidity. And then you will apply the selected Teslin epoxy top coat. Be sure to apply Teslin primers and top coats in accordance with their product data sheets, application, and equipment recommendations. When applying the Teslin primers, it's important to take continuous wet film thickness readings throughout the primer application process to ensure compliance with the specification and product data sheet. Teslin primers are commonly applied between 10 and 12 mils wet, 250 to 305 microns. Once the proper wet film thickness is reached, allow a minimum of 30 minutes before top coating for the primer's solvents to flash off. As seen in the video, the line I draw on the paint film demonstrates that the primer is still wet after the 30 minutes have elapsed. Although the primer is still wet, you can now apply Teslin epoxy top coats in accordance to the product data sheet's application and equipment recommendations to the wet, uncured primer. The top coats are commonly applied between 8 and 10 mils wet, 205 to 250 microns. It is important to remember that the total wet film thickness measurements taken on the gauge during the top coat application is now a combination of both the primer and the top coat's wet film thickness. Now let's take a look at how the three steps apply to the Teslin urethane top coat process. For the Teslin 2x1 wet edge urethane top coat process, you will apply the appropriate Teslin primer for your specific application. You will allow a minimum of 90-minute flash-off period where the solvents will evaporate. Again, please note that the flash period may vary depending upon temperature and humidity. And then you will apply the selected Teslin urethane top coat. Just like with the epoxy application, taking continuous wet film thickness readings during the primer application is required to ensure compliance with the specification and the product data sheet. Teslin primers are commonly applied between 10 and 12 mils wet, 250 to 305 microns. Once the proper wet film thickness is reached, allow a minimum of 90 minutes for the primer's solvents to flash off before top coating. Although the primer is still wet, you can now apply Teslin urethane top coats in accordance with their data sheet. Urethane top coats are generally applied between 4 and 7 mils wet, 100 to 175 micron. It is again important to remember that the total wet film thickness measurements taken during the top coat application are a combination of both the primer and the top coat's wet film thickness measurements. Please note that as the primer's solvents evaporate during the flash-off period between the primer and top coat applications, the wet film thickness of the primer coat will decrease by approximately 2 mils. Therefore, when recording wet film thickness measurements taken during the top coat application, you'll need to add 2 mils to the wet film thickness readings you get. For example, let's say the specification requires that the Teslin primer is to be applied at 10 mils wet film thickness, and the Teslin top coat is to be applied at 8 mils wet film thickness, making for a total system wet film thickness of 18 mils. You therefore apply the Teslin primer at 10 mils. But now you need to wait the appropriate time for the solvents to flash off to use the Teslin 2x1 wet edge process. During this flash off period, what happens is that the solvents flash off and the volume or the wet film thickness will shrink or reduce by approximately 2 mils. When you now go and apply the top coat at 8 mils wet film thickness per spec, and then you measure your wet film thickness during this application, you will get a total wet film thickness of 16 mils and not 18 due to the volume lost during the solvents flash off period. To account for this, you'll need to add 2 mils to the final wet film thickness readings during the top coat application to account for what was lost during the primer's flash off period. There may be times when using the Teslin 2x1 wet edge wet on wet application process that a completed area may be impacted by some overspray from a new area application the following day. When you find this to be the case, a good touch-up procedure to perform is to apply the primer to the substrate, being sure to minimize the extent of the overspray into the previously completed area. Apply your top coat then via the 2x1 wet edge process to the newly primed area first, then apply the top coat to the adjacent area impacted by the primer overspray in multiple light passes in order to blend it in with the new application. It doesn't take much time or material to do this, and when everything is dry, the sections will tie in well. Thank you for your time, and please contact Tesla NanoCoatings at 330-809-6700 and select option number 2 for tech support if you have any additional questions.